So I think we've stabilized a bit in number, so we can probably go ahead and get started. So this is just right now to make sure we're all in the right place here. Sharing human participants' data, challenges, and potential solutions. My name is Jen Dara. I am a research data management consultant in the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences in the Duke University Libraries. I am also a curator and a member of the team that manages the Duke Research Data Repository here at Duke, obviously. Sorry. And I have with me my colleague Sophia Lafferty-Hess, who will be manning the chat if any technical issues come up or things like that, or she also will be hitting some question points too. You know, if you have something you want to ask in chat, that's totally fine. I will be stopping at regular points to actually address questions, but please do feel free to ask at any given point in time if you have a question that comes to mind. Okay, so to start us off, if you've come to any of our workshops before, we always talk about this, but we always like to plug the work of our department, which is the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences. We have a team of data experts that provide instruction and consulting on a variety of topics that support data-driven research here at Duke, including data science, GIS and mapping, data visualization, and data management and curation. So what we're going to focus on today is basically the funder and publisher data sharing policies and their impact on human participants' research, how to plan for data sharing at the time of submitting a data management and sharing plan, at the time of submitting an IRB application, and also when drafting consent language. We're also going to look at determining and learning about different de-identification strategies and assessing risk, and also about identifying potential data repositories. So what I'd like to start with is a reading of the room, which is basically just to get an idea of the folks that I'm talking to. So there's going to be a Zoom poll that comes up. So let me launch that. And there's just 3 questions asking whether or not you regularly work with human participants in research, if you've shared data from human participants before, and how you've shared human participants' data, which you can choose more than one option there. All right, looks like we've got most folks who have participated. So just about. So it looks like we're kind of split when it comes to people in this workshop who work with human participants. So it's good. I'm going to give, I guess, a little bit of background as to why we treat human participants research the way we do. For those who are familiar with this, I'm not going to, belabor the point because it's things that you learn in IRB. Some of it's what you learn in IRB training, but it looks like for the most part, we have more that have not shared data from human participants before, and those that have look like they've either done that through a controlled access repository or in some other way. Would somebody who put other be willing to put in the chat what way that was? Just out of curiosity. I mean, if not, you don't have to, but I just thought it would be interesting to see. Okay, yeah, Dukebox. Okay. So that's more of an internal sharing. So I guess I probably could have expanded that to be more. I'm talking about actually sharing beyond the project. But that's true. Sometimes people do that too through Dukebox with collaborators. So great. Thanks for sharing, folks. I appreciate that. So it looks like we got a pretty mixed group, but it's kind of evenly divided. So that's pretty cool. So just to dive right into some of this. I imagine that most of you at this point are aware of the fact that most research funders, including the big ones for Duke like NIH, are requiring all grants that generate scientific data to include a data management and sharing plan as part of the application. Those that do not have these kinds of policies yet, or more nebulous policies, they're supposed to be getting their houses in order, so to speak, regarding public access to research results by 2025 per the Nelson memo that came out in 2022. So all federal agencies are supposed to have their policies online and ideally resources to support those policies as of 2025, but that could happen sooner. For funders, the point here is for the public to get a return on the financial investment in research activities. So, in essence, having some transparency is what that money is being spent for, and to avoid funding duplicative data collection efforts when data already exists. So, that fiscal responsibility. And then, of course, overall, the purpose really is to promote good scientific practice by making data available for testing reproducibility of results, replication of methods, and to foster new science using existing data. Beyond funders, most major publishing houses have data availability policies to ensure that the research data underlying findings reported in articles are accessible for reproducibility purposes. This includes publishers such as PLOS, Nature, and the journals under the umbrella of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So data sharing, we've been sharing data for a while now through research publications. So the question here is, how exactly is that different? Well, the idea is to go from reporting results in visuals and tables like this to providing readers with the foundational data used to create those figures. So in other words, instead of only getting an aggregate picture, where is the microdata that I can analyze myself to either test the results, or even if it's a big broad-based study that could be of use to multiple different kinds of research projects, how could I get at this data? Some timely advice from NIH on protecting privacy when sharing human participants' data was published a few months before the January 2023 data management and sharing policy went into effect. A lot of what I'm going to be covering in this workshop directly relates to the operational principles listed here. I think the key terms to keep in mind throughout this workshop are communication and vigilance. It's going to come up often. So this is the part where if you've already worked with human participants a lot, you can have a moment, have a sip of coffee. For those who do not, this is going to orient you to what we're looking at here. So basically, since the end of the Second World War, multiple doctrines were established to protect human participants in research. Perhaps the heaviest emphasis across all of the doctrines, and that are still critical things today, are obtaining proper consent, which actually also includes the right to be forgotten, and seeking to do no harm, be that physical, psychological, social, or cultural. The Code of Federal Regulations, Title 45, Part 46, also known as the Common Rule, is what governs research on human participants in the United States. It is what established institutional review boards and defines what exactly is a human subject and how their autonomy and privacy should be protected. And it was last updated in 2018. In addition to the Common Rule, there are many other specialized regulations that affect the treatment of data derived from humans in research and abroad. So some of these include HIPAA, so the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is primarily focused on protected health information, or PHI. So if you work at the health center, you work within a HIPAA-covered entity and are required to abide by HIPAA and how you treat both administrative and research data. There is a lot of help on the medical side for how to handle Duke PHI, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is focused on student education records, and this primarily affects administrative data, but of course a lot of student success data and transcripts and things like that are used for research and program improvement. Another one is FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security and Management Act. This is a comprehensive framework to protect government information, operations, and assets. So some federally provided and funded data, some of the programmatic type stuff, has to be stored according to strict federal FISMA guidelines. And internationally, some countries are very strict about protecting privacy. You probably heard one of the more recent is the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, out of the EU. It is really broad, but It's also pretty stringent, so it can be a little bit tricky to figure out what's exactly under the regulation's purview. And just to talk a little bit more about it, because it has been causing a ripple effect for countries outside of the EU to consider developing and passing data protection laws for their citizens. Like, for example, Vietnam and Tanzania both recently passed laws that do align pretty closely with the language in the GDPR. But basically, what the GDPR is a regulation that was established in 2016 so that all European Union member countries would have the same policy. It is, like I said, broad, and it's fairly general in nature, and it governs all data on EU citizens, whether that's commercial, administrative, or research. You've probably noticed over the past few years that now all websites have to warn you when they collect cookies and what they do with the information they collect. This is actually because of the GDPR. So basically, when it comes to research, it defers to existing ethical and legal frameworks, and that they should continue to be consulted to guide the research community. But due to its general applicability, it's not really prescriptive about how personal data can be used for research, such what does anonymized actually mean in the context of research data, and how access to research data extends beyond borders. So, what's really important, I think, bottom line is that you have consent to collect and process personal data. Really important. This is something that I have read in both the Vietnam and Tanzanian laws, as well as that having that consent or what to do with data, that you get that clear and upfront. If you need more information about GDPR, of course, the Office of Audit Risk and Compliance can help you out with those questions. And I actually have a training video listed here, which, by the way, since I think we're probably somewhat stable now with the amount of people, Sophia can actually share the slides in the chat if you want to follow along. I'll send them as a follow-up too afterwards. So another thing that's important to note is that not all regulations across the globe are clear, and in some cases, they might not be expressly written. So you need to do your research, of course, with regard to country and cultural standards for the treatment of human participants and their data. So when in doubt or unclear, the US standards for human subjects protection should at a minimum be followed. The IRBs at Duke can, of course, help when regulations are unclear. So the bottom line, the biggest thing is never assume. Should never ever assume. You should always ask. This is why consent is so important. So before I move on, I'm happy to pause if anybody has any questions so far. And I'll do the usual 3-second have a sip of water to see if folks have questions.
Hi, Jen. I do have a question.
Sure.
So, when we talk about sharing data, is for let's say that I have data collected from a different country, and then I'm here. Then I have a collaborator, for example, in Asia he needs my data. We collaborate on something to do the analysis at that country. Is it defined sharing, or if it yes, do I have to get any permission to do so? As long as I do have an RB protocol about that project that we got the data originally from.
So I think I can address this in a couple different ways, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. So typically when you are collecting data on individuals in other countries, there will be some local laws that you have to follow for how that data is treated. In some places, you may end up with a binding agreement that says you're not allowed to share the data any further than beyond the project. So that could happen. I would say, this is something that a lot of the folks in the Duke Global Health Institute deal with, is you want to make sure that the consent is clear if it's going to be data that's collected and then shared more broadly outside of the project. And you want to make sure that the actual local ethics board or whomever also is on board with you sharing the data as well. So it's basically making sure that, yes, you do have permission from all of those angles. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of goes back with my never assume, it's best to ask, because there are times where, we've dealt with that with the Duke Research Data Repository, where somebody has data from, Tanzania or one of those countries with privacy laws, and they didn't have explicit consent for data sharing, so we can't take it. So it's one of those situations. So speaking of IRBs, and to begin talking about the process of human research participants, it's important to know that Duke has two IRBs, depending on where you're at, whether you're at campus or whether you're at the health system, school of medicine, or school of nursing. So both of them serve the same purpose, to basically review human participants' research protocols and approve those, and also help you develop consent. But they don't necessarily use the same forms or processes. So it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with which IRB you would be using. One piece of advice for any human participants research, including that from secondary data, is to never assume that something is exempt from IRB review. Even though you can see what's defined as what's considered exempt, that is something that only the IRB can determine. And really, if you do have to do that determination where you're pretty much already sure it's going to end up being exempt, they have a really short exempt application process. So that way you just make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. Because what could happen is, say you originally planned to just get people's thoughts and experiences for an internal program type thing at Duke, but then you decide, oh, these are really interesting results and I'd like to publish this more broadly. If you haven't gotten IRB approval, you technically should not be doing that. So it's one of those things, even if you think something's exempt, never assume, make sure you do the exempt application with the IRB. So now to talk a bit about informed consent. Oop, I went too fast with the finger there. So depending on the IRB that you're working with, you could end up using a template for your consent form. And templates, definitely can be very helpful, but they don't necessarily always address data sharing in adequate detail. So if you're using a template, I would ask the IRB for assistance on how to properly write in what data you plan to share and how you plan to share it. We actually have worked with the DUHS IRB to develop standard language that talks about data sharing that could be incorporated into consent forms. And that's definitely extraordinarily helpful to have that kind of information, because what we used to see was consent forms that would come in and say research results may be shared in journal articles, conference proceedings, and presentations. But that's not really communicating your intent to publish the actual data set for others to use. And this is also something that NIH is asking for people to be a lot more clear about what's going to happen with that underlying study data. Where is it going, so that participants, given that they're volunteers in this process, know what's happening to their information. So also, you need to be mindful of using terms like de-identified or de-identification in the consent, because both could be a bit loaded and you can seem to either under and over promise. So you want to share in plain language how you'll protect someone's private information. For the average participant, of course, de-identified can mean many things. So if you aren't sure how to best explain your data sharing intent and how you're going to mask people's identities in plain terms, I can definitely help provide some advice on drafts, as can both IRBs. And of course, the IRB is the ultimate approving body for any written or verbal consent script process. So while we are seeing good progress in data sharing language being included in current consent documents, as a data curator for the past several years, I have seen issues with forms from projects prior to a lot of these new data sharing requirements. And of course, it can be hard to break established wording habits, especially if you have a good template, you want to keep going with it. Now's the time where things are going to have to change. And these are some of the common problems that I have seen when reviewing consent forms for data sharing. So stating that the data will only be accessed by the research team, stating that the data will only be used for a particular project, putting an expiration date on the data, saying that it's going to be destroyed at some point. It'll disappear. It won't exist anymore. The first three paint you into a corner when it comes to reuse of the data, and that includes your own reuse, not even talking about other people. It's very rigid and would likely require reconsent for reuse of data for new purposes, even by the original PI. The other two here, not differentiating between defining, your contact information is something that should be private, but your study records, your research data is something that could be shared, or not adequately explaining how personal identifiers will be, removed or masked in plain language. That could be a little bit tough when you're trying to be more upfront about data sharing. Something else that's important is the notion of opting out of data sharing is also important. Participants are exactly that. They're volunteers who participate. So they should be able to say that they don't want their data to be shared just as much as they should be permitted to drop out of a study without penalty. Yes, that's something else you have to track, but it is an important thing to offer folks. So before I move on, I'm happy to take questions, but we're going to do a quick exercise on evaluating consent language for the issues I just raised. Does anybody have any burning questions right now? Okay, I think I waited the obligatory 3 seconds. So we'll just move on with the exercise. Very short, very easy. Well, easy enough. And you can enter in chat. Yeah, that's probably the fastest way to get through this because we do have almost 150 people in here. So basically, what we're going to start with is a consent language mistake. What's the problem with saying in a consent form that your data will be kept completely anonymous and confidential? Yeah, Eric, anonymous is ambiguous to most people, and actually, and someone else said it's impossible to keep things completely anonymous. And you know why? If you ever collected identifying information, you actually can't really ever call anything anonymous because you did have identifiers at some point. So yeah, it's definitely a word to avoid. And yeah, being very absolute, like things like completely, that's yeah, some false trust. So you want to avoid language like this. So how you could potentially make this better is you could say something like this. The answers you provide in the health assessment survey and your body measurements will be used only for research purposes and in ways that will not reveal who you are. Your contact information will be kept private and will not be shared with anyone outside of the project. So this differentiates between that administrative data versus the study data, how you're going to basically provide what you're providing, for other people to use for research. So just being a bit more clear. But yeah, you completely is a no-no, and anonymous is also a no-no. So the second language mistake. The data we collect will only be used for project name and only accessible to the research team. What's the problem here? Remember what I said just a little bit before about corners. Yep, people caught it. In this case, you're saying that basically you're only going to use it this one time ever for this project. And even then, you can't share it beyond the research team. So again, really, really rigid. So that this makes it so that anything you would want to do with that data in the future, you'd have to seek reconsent and actually new IRB approval for a new project. So yeah, don't do that to yourself, basically. So another thing that you could say instead, any personal information that could identify you will be removed or changed before study files are shared with other researchers or results are made public. So just being a bit more explicit and a bit broader to allow for more flexibility and reuse. All right, here's another one. Your data will be housed on Duke-owned systems and will be expunged when the project is completed. What's the problem? Yeah, Bobby, it's close because the thing is you are in the corner again. The issue is you say that data is going to disappear. You said you're not going to retain it. And at this point in time, funders expect you to retain data, but also Duke does as well. We had our research data policy come online in May of this past year, and you have to keep things for 6 years post-publication. So shouldn't say those kind of things. Plus, expunged is a really weirdly big word. And I think sometimes people lean on Duke-owned as well to be like, well, that's good enough because Duke's a major university. You don't need to be super specific on some of these things. You can say secure systems, stuff like that. It's just, yeah, the biggest problem is the expunged when the project is completed. So beyond that, here's another example. So this information will be kept for the length of the study, 5 years on Duke-owned secure systems. After that time, your identifying information will be removed or replaced with numeric codes as appropriate. The key linking your identity to those codes will be destroyed. That is something that can disappear. And the de-identified data will then be deposited with repository names so that it may be shared with other researchers. If you do know the name of the repository, that's wonderful because that actually also gives participants a way to see how their data is advancing science, how they can see how it's being used. It's a good thing for folks to know. All right, so this last one, this isn't exactly wrong, And it's actually probably, I would say, from some of the older consent forms, some of the better language I've seen. So, but how could you make this better? Instead of just saying your anonymized data will be shared with the greater research community in a publicly accessible data archive, what would you add to make it even more clear to participants what you're doing? Yeah, Bobby, you could specify the community, again, mention the repository. Yeah, exactly, David. You guys got it. So here's an example here where we talk about it. Your responses to the survey will not be linked to your name, contact information, or medical record number. While it is not likely that you could be identified by your responses, special care is being taken to protect your privacy so that other researchers may analyze data from the survey. The survey data will be housed in a controlled access archive called the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. So yeah, this goes real specific, tells you where the data is going to go, and it also lets folks know that it's going to be under controlled access, which is something that we'll talk about more as we move on. But thank you all for participating. You guys, not that I thought you wouldn't, I knew you'd catch these, but these are just really good things to keep in mind, especially when we're so used to using the same templates over and over again. You really want to look at those and assess whether or not they're still actually true. It's very important. So now we're going to talk a little bit about preserving confidentiality when sharing data. So there are times, obviously, where some detailed information is really necessary for analysis and part of the intent of collecting the data. And you want to retain as much analytic utility as you can, but also protect participants. And this is where understanding general principles and methods of de-identification can be really helpful. We'll be covering some simple and some more advanced techniques, but the advanced technique really high level. So one of the things I always like to emphasize is please do always seek input from experts to determine if your data are adequately de-identified. Don't put that all on yourself. Even when you remove direct identifiers alone, that's not necessarily going to render a data set good enough de-identified or safe for open dissemination. So you really need to consider where there might be indirect identifiers or other unique information present in or about the data that could result in identity disclosure. And then also considering what the relative risk of potential harm there would be to participants if their identity were discovered. Again, in most cases with the, quantitative research, it's not going to be physical harm, but you could have, things like psychological harm, you could have social harms, you could have financial harms, even potentially if somebody's an illicit, if it's illicit behaviors you're looking at. So again, what is that risk of harm? One of the things that I do want to say is I'm not an expert. I know enough to be dangerous is what I usually say. And I'm not an official honest broker for Duke. I can definitely point out potential issues and advise on simple techniques for masking data. And I do that for the Duke Research Data Repository. But I cannot guarantee or certify that all issues are eliminated. I can't say, make an expert determination that data is perfectly de-identified. For that, you're going to always want to seek the advice of either an official honest broker, through the programs that are available at Docker, or you want to have a knowledgeable statistician on your team who is well-versed in statistical disclosure control techniques. If you are seeking funding from a federal agency like NIH, this is something that you can and definitely should include in your budget because it can be very complex. And some places will charge upwards of $10,000 for de-identification. So if that's something that is going to be affecting you, I would definitely keep that in mind. Okay, so as I mentioned, Docker, the Duke Office of Clinical Research, they do have honest broker services. They also offer support for a restricted collection in Zenodo, which is mainly for Duke PHI not consented. So unconsented Duke patient data, if you have to share that, and you come to us, we will actually send you to the Duke Office of Clinical Research to work with the Zenodo collection. They also have some support for the commercial licensing policy as well, if you have questions about that. They do have some policies, and I have them linked here. I believe that's the link. But some of them are going to be behind Shibboleth, so just keep that in mind. You might have to log in order to read them. But in any case, Duke clinical data And that would be any Duke patient data. They have very specific processes it has to go through before it can be shared outside of the university. So this is something to really, make sure that you follow the, dot your I's and cross your T's. And Docker is a great place to start for help. So just to make sure that those of you on the health side are aware of that.
Jen, I did want to elevate one question before you moved on from the clinical research data, because Dr. Sung asked that he thought there was a new policy that unconsented PHI has to reside in PACE. And I thought maybe we could say, from our understanding, PACE, it has to go through the honest broker process to leave PACE. But from what we have been told in our understanding, right, that once it has gone through that de-identification process by a vetted honest broker, then it could potentially go into this Docker Zenodo collection that is maintained by Docker. But you can say more about your understanding of that.
Correct. So PACE is for the basic active storage. So when you're doing the analysis, that's where the data sits. So that way it's in essentially what is considered a controlled enclave where you do your analysis and do all of those things. I know in most cases the data may already come to PACE de-identified, but that's just an added layer of protection. What I'm talking about and what we're talking about with data sharing, this is beyond the outside. You're done doing your analysis, either your journal publisher or your funders asking you to share the data. And in that instance, that is where the Duke Office of Clinical Research has started that Zenodo collection in order to assign a particular license that they want to be used for general research not being commercialized. And also if you have things like with the obvious proliferation of AI tools and things like that, people who have a lot of medical images or things like that they want or need to share, if you want to make sure that you have some commercial aspect of that, that is something that they'll support for that too.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, but if when you go through the honest broker process and you de-identify it, you remove the PHI, right? So there's no longer PHI that's going in Zenodo or whatever. But I thought your slide said PHI would go in Zenodo.
No, pretty much anything that used to be PHI, I think that's more the issue, is if it came from Duke patients, whether or not it meets the HIPAA definition of PHI any longer, that's just this unconsented data, which typically are, like you said, all the identifiers removed. This is the process that they want. And it's just Duke patient data. If you have patient data from outside of Duke, it can be treated differently. So it's kind of a Duke policy, if that if that explains things. But if if this is something that you've encountered and you have questions about it, we can definitely get you in touch with the right people. So I'm happy to do that. Sophia, do you have anything to add?
No, but no, I think you covered that well. There are two other questions. Dr. Sung's also asking about free resources for de-identification. I would actually recommend talking to Docker more about that. I know that there is it depends on what you're de-identifying. There's a few tools that I know about there for like medical images, but I don't know if there's a lot of free resources. Jen, you might know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely it's one of those things that I think most of them are self-serve in the sense of that there are packages and things like that you can use for statistical disclosure control. There are some like DICOM cleaner and some other things that I think people that are open source, but again, it's still kind of on you to make sure that you've de-identified it enough. And that would be something you might do that before you have somebody confirm that everything looks good to go. Some repositories will actually do an assessment of risk for you depending on who you're working with. But yeah.
And I know that there are some tools too for like checking for like things like social security numbers and stuff like that are more automated. And there's another one that came out for qualitative data that's a tool set, but I'd have to find that. I'll maybe search around for that one, but
right. And David mentioned this is true. There are some tools that are built into REDCap as well, so that to make that a little bit easier before you do any exporting. And then I saw there was another question about having people opt out of consent, yes, that is a separate section in the consent form. It's either a little paragraph or you have a field. However, it's going to be easier for you to track that information. If somebody opts out, it could be a checkbox, just to make sure that people have the option to say they'd rather not share their data. People have done it the other way too, where they've had it be opt-in. So I think it just kind of depends on the size of your participant population and what's going to be the easiest to do record keeping wise.
Yeah, I've seen that also a lot more commonly with qualitative data versus quantitative data, because it can be a lot easier to separate out one person's responses if it's all kind of like interview data versus quantitative statistical analyses, as that can also cause more issues with the opt-in, opt-out with reproducibility, because you'll have missing observations from your data set. But again, these are all kind of things you have to balance and consider when determining what community you're working with too, I think. And Jen might more with that, there are certain communities where giving them that agency to opt in, opt out can be particularly important as well. So I think these are things the IRB may be able to also help you think through.
Yes, when in doubt, the IRB is definitely very helpful for working with any type of participant population. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'll keep moving on. And I'm glad Sophia stopped me, especially if we start collecting a bunch that we want to answer. So, but yeah, please don't shy away from putting questions in the chat. We're happy to stop and answer them at any point. So, one of the things that's important to know when it comes to de-identification of data is that, yes, direct identifiers, that's something that you could easily, get rid of, but you have to keep in mind that there could be other ways people's identities could be discovered just because there's unique characteristics of that particular person in the data. So that could be, you could have a survey data set where there's only one female veteran from the Air Force that's 54 or something like that, where it's very unique information about a person. And again, it depends on what type of detail is there in there that's unique, combined with the risk of harm to determine how data can ethically be shared. So just wanted to make sure that, we're understanding that there is potential for people's identities to be discovered, even if you do your best with de-identification. And in those cases, there may be other ways that you have to share data that aren't as straightforward as others. So this is a general list of personal identifiers that are both direct and indirect. And this is actually derived from ICPSR, which is a longstanding social and behavioral sciences archive. HIPAA does have its own specific list as to what is considered to be an identifier. I believe there's 18 of them and how they're supposed to be treated. In general, though, this list is actually pretty comprehensive across a lot of those different alphabet soup regulations I mentioned earlier. When you're collecting data, one of the things to do is that if you don't need identifiers, don't collect them, because you really should determine what's going to be absolutely necessary for analysis. If you have less identifiers in the data at front, it makes the identification a much less onerous process. So like if you don't need the IP address or things like that, wipe those out right away. Make sure that those aren't things that you're keeping in the data. So some other identifiers. I'm bringing this up because when I'm doing curatorial review for data that goes into the Duke Research Data Repository, these are some of the things that I could see pretty quickly that could end up being problematic. So if you're promising some level of confidentiality, but you want to share your data openly, then you don't necessarily want to keep some of this unique information. So this would include verbatim text responses. So when somebody has the option for other and they, only one or two people answer other and it's verbatim, that can be pretty identifiable. Other cases where you have extremely small cell counts, where only a small fraction of the folks actually answer the question, those are things you might want to suppress simply because they can be more identifiable. Or it could be something, can you code it up? Can you put it up into an existing coding scheme? And then often people will leave exact dates. Now, if you're trying to strictly follow HIPAA safe harbor standard for de-identification, you can only use year. You cannot have dates. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going for a fully open access repository with data that has HIPAA concerns. And you also need to be mindful with HIPAA of any participants who are over the age of 89, that they need to be recorded as age 90 and above. So again, some of these go with certain particular requirements, but again, keeping in mind These are things I see often of people leaving in verbatim text responses, small cell counts, exact dates. Those are things you want to try to avoid too. So before we dive into a bit more about de-identification techniques, and I want to mention that even with the best de-identification, of course, there is still the potential that someone could be identified. The techniques that are out there today could end up being broken by someone down the line, and we have to have new techniques. Again, it is extremely important to assess what the risk of harm of being identified poses to participants. Data that has a higher risk of harm, even when de-identified as much as possible, shouldn't be shared openly. And I'll talk about different options for data sharing when we get to that repositories section. I don't know if you've heard of Latanya Sweeney, but she is a Harvard privacy scholar who's done more than 20 years of work in data de-identification and re-identification. And in order to illustrate a fairly complex principle for how even limited information can lead to re-identification, her lab has developed ways for folks to test themselves to see how unique you are where you are. And I have an option for you to do this test yourself. Sophia will put the link in the chat. But if you're not comfortable in putting your birth date, gender, and zip code into a website, I don't care. You don't have to. That's fine. You can just observe. But yeah, Sophia will add it to the chat if you want to take this test yourself. Make sure you do the one on the right side, not the left, and it should only take a minute or two. This is only 3 pieces of information. Keep that in mind. So while you're finishing up, I'll let you know mine. With my exact date of birth, my gender, and my zip code, I am the only person in my Durham zip code that is a female with the birthday of May 11th, 1976. That's 3 pieces of information. In order to fuzz that a bit better, we could just say if I gave my birth year and still female in my zip code, well, there's a lot more people that match that who have my birth year and my gender, but are in my zip code. And then finally, to fuzz it even more, I could put it as a range that I was born between 1976 and 1980. So now there's a lot more people that are in the same range as me. So basically, it shows how small changes can actually significantly impact how identifiable you are in data. So basically, that test that we just did is a simple way of looking at a concept called K-anonymity, which was created as a means to diminish the chances of re-identification of individuals in publicly released data. So you want K to be as high a number as it can be while keeping the data relevant and useful. There are additional methods such as L diversity and P-sensitive K-anonymity, but these type of disclosure control prevention tools and things to meet those, it's really best understood by those who can do that expert level determination about data de-identification. And I will say it doesn't always work for every kind of data set too. We talk about things with too many categories, too much data. So again, it's sometimes talking with that person who knows what to do with that kind of data. So when it comes to de-identification methods that are more simple, these are things that definitely should be employed when possible. Depending on how you plan to release your data and what's necessary for analysis, of course, is key to determining what you need to keep and what you need to change. So for example, let's say dates kind of are important, but you don't want to have those as an identifier, then maybe you change it to a time interval instead. If you have verbatim responses for that other category in a survey, maybe you should code that, especially if it's something significant, say a bunch of people, answered the same thing. Or if it's not, then just get rid of it because clearly it's not going to really impact your analysis at all. If you have a very small sample, that can also be very challenging in itself for preserving confidentiality. There are cases where you might have to report aggregate information only and not individual level. And it could be a case where that data can't be shared openly. It really does depend on, you can talk with the funder sometimes and the publisher as to what's really realistic there. You really want to keep in mind what level of harm could occur. Again, this vigilance of if somebody's identity were to be discovered. So for the more complex methods, these definitely require someone with knowledge about statistical disclosure control methods. Many government agencies like the US Census Bureau, they use some of these more sophisticated techniques to protect large microdata sets that are released openly, like the American Community Survey. If you have the need to retain a lot of unique or specific information, you definitely seek someone who knows how to perform some of these more complex methods. And again, fortunately for funded research, you can budget for this type of assistance when you submit your grant proposal. If you know you're going to be working with a small, specific population, talking about illicit behaviors, health status, and even, say you're doing a longitudinal project, you really want to think critically about what de-identification assistance you might need down the line. This is much better to address ahead of time than at the end when it may be impossible because you don't have a budget anymore. And as I mentioned, we were talking about tools. SDC Micro, that's an R-based package. So, if you are pretty much a stats wonk, that's something you may want to test out. So I'm happy to take some questions, and then we'll do a break before we move on to the data sharing and practice section.
So you do have a question about defining what is small sample size? Like, is 20 small? What would you give some guidance in that area, Jen?
I would say 20, yes, is pretty small, but it depends on what the data set contains. If you have a small sample of 20 people, and there are 20 people all with a very specific health condition that's rare, then that could be really difficult to keep confidential. You could have 20 people in a room and ask them their favorite flavor of ice cream. Obviously, that wouldn't really be a sensitive kind of thing. So again, it's size plus some of the things that you might also be collecting about the person and their uniqueness. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm happy to give everybody till 2:55. So please do take a quick stretch break, grab some coffee. I need to refill my water. But yeah, meet me back here at 2:55 and we will start wrapping up. If you have questions in the interim, please do feel free to toss them into the chat and we'll address them before we get started. Okay, so I think we're about ready to start back up. See if we had any questions in between. Nope, just Sophia reminding folks about RCR rules, which is important. Okay, so now we're going to talk about data sharing in practice, okay? And this is where we're talking about data sharing as data publishing. So you're actually taking that underlying data and you're going to share that. So the quote that I have here is from the H2020 program, which is out of the European Commission. And I'm going to mention actually that the EU and the UK are actually kind of ahead of us in some cases with data sharing. But basically the point here is that data should be as open as possible to facilitate reproducibility and reuse, but with the understanding that not all data can be completely open due to participant privacy. So this is one of those things where I've often tried to explain that open and public do not necessarily mean the same thing. Openly accessible means openly accessible, and I'll talk about this more in a little bit, whereas public means it's accessible to the public, but how they get access to the data is could follow a couple different steps. So that's something to say. In those instances, when you perform due diligence and de-identification, and when you leverage restricted access repositories, or even if it's something where you can't share data and you can't assert ownership, but you can at least talk about where you got your data from, there's all kinds of different options to figure out that appropriate home for sharing your data. And this is going to be guided, of course, by policy requirements, your discipline or data type, and the questions surrounding the risk to others from releasing a given data set. So the first point on this slide here, is unique information present even if data are technically de-identified. This relates back to the NIH operational principles on protecting privacy by being clear about data sharing intent. NIH has gone so far as to put out specific guidelines on how to engage in research and data sharing with Indigenous Americans. For the global Indigenous perspective, the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance are something that you should definitely consult. Beyond privacy, the CARE principles address ensuring that the participant population sees a benefit for their engagement in research. And some of this is what Sophia was also talking about, some of the cultural rules and norms there. Opting out of data sharing could be extremely important to some communities. So you really need to be mindful about how your own, sort of implicit bias, based on your lived experiences, resources, and cultural understanding, how those affect how you conduct research and treat research data. Some additional things to think about as you wrap up your research and are getting ready to prepare your data for sharing. Does your data management and sharing plan mirror, what you said you would do? In actuality, NIH does allow you to make adjustments to the plans that they have on file for you. I imagine other agencies likely will do similar, when we reach that 2025 deadline. Because really, truly, and I think folks who have done, the NIH data management and sharing plan, it can be hard to know exactly what your course of action will be at the proposal phase. Beyond any data management or sharing plan, well, what about your IRB protocol? I know that both IRBs would prefer that you update them, with data sharing plans while your protocol is still open. If you were fortunate enough to have your funder or publisher specify what repository you should use, this takes a lot of guesswork out of the process. We always recommend for those seeking funding that you check in the call for proposals and with the program officer to ensure that your data deposit plans align with funder expectations. So, for example, much of the research funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a sub-institute of NIH, they expect you to use the NIM Data Archive. Some repositories like the NIM Data Archive have very prescriptive processes about how to prepare data for submission. So if you're aware right away that this is, something you're going to have to do, you can start planning at the project outset instead of trying to hurry up and get everything done at the end, which can sometimes actually not be possible. So NIH has tried to be very proactive in providing services to meet their data management and sharing plan requirements, including guidance on how to best select a repository, which is here, but it's actually pretty broadly applicable beyond NIH. And they also have an entire website dedicated to data sharing at sharing.nih.gov. So if you are an NIH researcher and you have not looked at that, please definitely do. They've been really good about keeping their FAQs up to date and anything, especially when it comes to budgeting and some of the questions about, can I share my data? Am I allowed? But in any case, if you're at a loss about what repositories to select, I want to plug that this is the perfect time to request a consultation with Sophia or myself or both of us about what repository or repositories could be the best fit for your data, because sometimes you might have to have more than one. If you're interested in learning more about assessing repositories, we do have 2 workshop opportunities coming up for you to learn more, one online and one in person, and it's the title is Preparing Data for Publishing. If Sophia finds that she can put that link up, if not, it's on the CDVS workshops webpage. But that's something we will be talking about more in depth. I think March is when we're looking at that. So I know I'm leaning kind of heavily on NIH because it's a big funder here at Duke. But this is actually kind of broadly applicable to any human participants research to decide whether something should be under some level of controlled access or if it could be, open and unrestricted. So unrestricted or open can be used when explicit consent is obtained for data sharing and the de-identified data is of little to no risk of harm due to accidental identity disclosure. So in other words, the information that's in there is fairly innocuous. If somebody's identity were to be discovered, it's not going to be controversial, harmful in any particular way. I toyed with the idea of listing some examples where we could chat about where the data could go, but I was concerned that this is a really huge group and that we would run out of time, which is possible, but we'll see. I think I might actually be able to give you a little bit of time back today. But I am going to talk about this because it's a spectrum as to what kind of options there are for data sharing. Some data sets may need more than one repository, have parts of data that are open, have parts of the data that are closed. So open and unrestricted, that means exactly that. There are no barriers to obtaining access to the data. There might be a license or terms of acceptable use to follow, like a Creative Commons license. But that's pretty much, on the end user to make sure that they do that. Open data should still be cited properly, just like any information you reference and incorporate into your own work. Controlled access can be used in a variety of ways. The simplest could be that someone has to create an account and click through an acceptable use agreement. Some may have you say how you plan to use the data in addition to that. Some may ask you to fill out a full IRB approved project application and enter in a formal data use agreement. Some may ask you to be able to secure the data in a particular way before they will even provide it to you. And some may go so far as to require you to use a virtual data enclave, which actually, to me, is the best way to keep things contained in a clean and secure environment. For those of you that work with PACE, it's like that, but that's actually for a data repository where basically you request to use that data there. You do all your analysis there. Your output's typically vetted before you get it and put it into your publications. So, and in some cases, at least like if I don't know if you've ever worked with a census data center, they have physical data enclaves. So this would be where you actually have to put aside all of your stuff, your phone, you're not allowed to take it in the room. It could have wireless blocking paint. Really, it goes through this entire spectrum. Citing practices, of course, remain the same throughout, but you should always be mindful, of what you're promising to do. If the data provider asks that you send them any output for potential disclosure before you publish it in an article, yeah, you definitely should do that. In most cases, controlled access typically means that you cannot share a copy of the data with anyone who isn't part of your project, and you cannot publish data files in other repositories. Funders and publishers are aware that this happens. And in that case, they just ask that you explain the circumstances, of why you can't share your data when that occurs. So just to give you an idea, if you have not worked with repositories with controlled access, I just wanted to show you, like, for example, this is a data record from a study in ICPSR, multi-level influences on HIV and substance use in a YMSM cohort. So pretty specific kinds of information here. Not surprised that this is actually a restricted data collection. So this would be one, if people want to access the data, they'd actually have to click on the restricted data button to learn more. And in this case, these are the things that they would have to do before they can even get access to the data. And then this is a case from Vivli, which is a general clinical data repository that we're members of, that they have a whole process for when people request data, because everything that they have in there has some level of access control. They tell you what the process entails. They have a data use agreement, and they also have a secure research enclave for people to use. Some repositories, like this is an NIH-based one, the NICHD- repository, they have a sample data use agreement to get an idea of the types of things that could be in an agreement. Often, the agreements are sort of a template, and the depositor may be able to pick and choose what types of things are in the data use agreement. But I just wanted you to be aware that these are things that you can look for when you're exploring different repositories. Go back to my slides here. So data use agreements, if you've never encountered them, this is basically when the repository becomes the proxy for the depositor to monitor data requests and use. That's the standard process. So basically, this allows a data set and a repository to have a one-to-many relationship as opposed to one-to-one, where each researcher has to ask each other for the data, and you might have to have an individual data use agreement for each one. In this case, the repository is that resource that will have the data use agreement, the request process, and manages all of that for the data depositor. And then just talking about some resources, if you find a repository, or you need to find a repository that can support data access across that spectrum, we're a member of a number of repositories that can provide these services. We are members with Vivli, as I mentioned, which is a general clinical repository. We are members of ICPSR, and we're also members of the Qualitative Data Repository, which I know Sophia wanted to give them a quick plug.
Yeah, the Qualitative Data Repository is a great resource if you are doing qualitative research. As Jen said, they can provide controlled access to data. They also have very skilled curation staff that will do some of that deductive disclosure review. So I think it's, again, important to note that most of these repositories are not going to be performing the de-identification for you, but they often can have useful resources or guidance in this space. So I'll actually put in the chat right now, the Qualitative Data Repository has partnered with other researchers that focus on qualitative data sharing, particularly on developing a toolkit. And there was that question that came up around, is there de-identification software out there? So they actually have a software that they've developed as part of this initiative and project that's focused on the de-identification of qualitative data. So no, that's not something that we dug into very deeply here today. We were mostly focusing on more of some of the quantitative approaches, but qualitative data when it comes to de-identification, almost many of them are kind of those open text responses that Jen was saying, you can drop if you want, but if that makes sense for your analysis and what you're sharing. But oftentimes for qualitative data, that's all that you have are those open text, rich responses. And so the de-identification of that data can be particularly challenging when we're thinking about maintaining confidentiality. And this is another reason that we really like to recommend when we're working with qualitative researchers to consider partnering with QDR on data sharing, because they'll also be able to give you specific guidance on making that determination about, what is that appropriate level of access controls that Jen was discussing. And again, they have curation staff that, look over all data sets prior to making them publicly available. And I don't know, Jen, if you're going to talk much more about like curation, but I just think that it's so valuable to think about and partner with a repository that has a skill set in the data type that you're working with. So while Jen and I are kind of generalists, and we both do have backgrounds in social sciences and public health data, behavioral data, things like that, human subjects, participants data for sure, there are some very specific kind of needs for some types of data. And I think qualitative data is one of those that really necessitates having a specific strategy, a specific de-identification strategy. So kind of rambling here, but I just wanted to mention that I think they're a great resource, as is Vivli and ICPSR. But the QDR folks, we know them very, very well. We're happy to connect you with their team. We were talking about data management sharing plans, like they like to get involved earlier as well in the process and are available to even provide some of those reviews and feedbacks on data management sharing plans, making sure you have that alignment between that consent form and that IRB protocol and that DMP and that data management and sharing plan. So just a great resource for any qualitative researchers out there.
Thanks, Sophia. And to add on to that, pretty much any repository that you plan to work with, especially the 3 that I have listed here, can help, with consent language. They have templates and things like that. For curatorial staff, I would say, QDR and ICPSR, they are deep experts in what it is that they do. So definitely great folks to leverage, if you are going to share data with them. I think it's important to mention with ICPSR as well, they are a membership-based archive. So if you are planning to use them for your repository of record to meet the NIH DMSP requirements, you are actually supposed to talk to them first, because they will give you a budget figure. Partly because since they're a membership archive, if the data has to be openly accessible, so people don't have to pay for it, this is what you have to do. So it's one of those things that they, since they're not technically open, they'll make you pay. Thanks, Sophia.
Actually, muted you as well, Jen. I was trying to mute.
That's okay. I saw that and it was no big deal. No problem. So, and also just to mention, and I think some folks mentioned earlier, they may have shared things through an NIH repository. They have a huge list that they have all by the different sub-agencies that can help, facilitate the sharing of certain types of data and have governance of the process and approval process, and also use, common data elements and standards. And it's, it's extraordinarily it's a huge list. And I would say, like the one I showed earlier with NICHD- another subagency, they have a lot of resources there on how to submit, when to submit, what to submit. So this is one of those things where, again, when you're at the beginning of your data process, say whether that's with a grant proposal or say you're not seeking funding, you're going straight to the IRB, you want to think about, again, that level of, what type of access am I probably going to need for this data? Am I going to potentially need to put it in a controlled access repository? What level of control? And just keep that in mind throughout the project. And finally, I mean, it's important to mention, of course, some human data can in fact be open. So if you have data that can be made openly accessible, we do have our Duke-based research data repository that's available. Sophia and I both do curation. We provide that second set of eyes on the data to make sure that it doesn't include any kind of identifiers, and can let you know if it does, what you need to do to address that. And we also are happy to review consent forms too, especially if you plan to use the RDR, to make sure that that language aligns as well. So when you cannot share, and that can happen, let's say that the data can't be shared or shouldn't be shared even with restrictions in place, then you can also consider other ways to engage in open science. And this includes situations where you might not have the right to share the data. So if it's proprietary or you got it under a data use agreement, there are other things you can share. So you could have other parts of your workflow, like your code and your documentation. You should be clear, in your documentation where others can find the data that you used in your analysis. If you know the data set names or the variables, having that kind of thing so that people have that is another way to be transparent and balance, the ethical limitations to data sharing. But you want to make sure, again, I know that PLOS is very strict and they can be very hardcore about, when you can't share data, you have to be 100% explicit as to why and what other steps you're going to take to make sure that you're meeting the spirit of their data sharing policy. So that's that on repositories. Sophia, you have something else to add?
Yeah, no, so we did have a good question from Bobby about, does NIH require them to use their repositories? And so I think, yeah, it'd be good to reiterate maybe some of the NIH rules around specific repositories versus kind of when you have that agency to decide on a repository in that assessment process.
Right. So I won't go sliding back through the slides, but I did mention earlier, this is something you want to check in the call for proposals. Sometimes it's mentioned there. And you want to check with the program officer, because sometimes they will say this is going to have to end up in XYZ. Like I know I'm doing a talk tomorrow for the folks in psychiatry. And since a lot of them do work with NIM, a lot of their data has to go to the NIM data archive. When it comes to making the choice, NIH so far says they strongly encourage repositories. And my tongue-in-cheek joke lately has been strongly recommends is just to the left of require, because they will push on that. They don't necessarily care if it's theirs or not, unless it's in the call for proposals or your program officer says so, that it's something that they want to build that collection. That being said, if their repository is going to be more appropriate because that's where most people would go to find that kind of research, I would always select that. I would always look for a domain or data type repository before I would go more general, just because that's where your data is more likely to be discovered. I mean, it still remains to be seen how data sharing is going to impact the promotion and tenure process. But if it does, and things are leaning that way, you'll want to make sure your data is in a place where it can be discovered and used by others. So that's often with the data, we were talking about the data communities. That's often with the folks that are in that particular community. But yes, so go ahead, Sophia.
I'll add one other thing to that, or two other quick points. It's just another example that maybe with people in this room might be aware of, is like this idea of you have to use a particular repository. A very common example there is like with human genomics data, that it has to go in places like dbGaP, or or for things like sequencing, that it's supposed to go in things like SRA or GEO. So these might be, I think, for those that have engaged in collecting genomics data, there has been kind of this more stringent data sharing policy in place for a longer period of time. And so what we're seeing now is that that kind of expectation is being expanded to all data that's being generated under an NIH grant. But again, there are very specific requirements if you are generating and collecting large-scale genomics data. And so that's like a really good example of when NIH is very explicit about what those expectations are. And they have a whole section on their sharing page that I've already put in the chat around some of those expectations. But again, it can be sometimes complicated. Like you do have to go through the call for proposals. You do have to kind of assess whether your data does comply or fall under that policy. And so that's one of the things that Jen and I can help with, is sometimes kind of interpreting those policies and how you can comply. But really one of the best sources can be talking to your program officer. And just the last kind of two more plugs I'll put in is thinking about it and contacting the repositories and the program officers early when you're having to think about these data management and sharing plans, because sometimes there are costs associated with it, as Jen said. Sometimes you really do have to talk to the repository of, is my data in scope? Will you take this? Am I the right place for the data? And those conversations are not something that you want to put off till the end. And I know that these data management and sharing policies and writing these plans is a new thing for quite a number of researchers. So you might not always be building in kind of the lead time that you might need to have those kind of deeper conversations with the repository staff. So just a big plug to start earlier in that planning. I think that that'll get you in a better place. And then I'm putting one last chat link in the chat. When it comes to this idea of, well, how do I assess or select a repository? And Jen, if you have this slide, let me help with it.
It's
NIH,
in the slides. Yeah, it's linked off the slides.
The NIH desirable characteristics. So just to say that they do have a set of kind of like, what do you want to look for in a repository? And there's various features, things like assigning a persistent identifier. So it's a sub part of that page. But just to say, like, as Jen said, we have a whole workshop on this, but it is useful to kind of start to understand what repositories can do for you and what you should be looking for when you do have that choice and it's not required to use NIH's repository for this specific type of data. I'll stop now.
So does anybody else have any more questions before we wrap up?